What made me understand that that night was unusual wasn't the noise. It was the silence that followed. I prefer not to say my name, and after what happened at that roadside stop on I-10, I learned that keeping certain things off the table is a way to continue driving in peace. I've been driving across the southern part of the country for years. I know every stretch of desert that seems endless. I've heard engines blow up, tires tear, and even transmissions die in the middle of nowhere. But that silence had weight. It was 2 a.m. when I pulled into the isolated rest stop in Arizona, one of those that exist more out of state obligation than real activity. The lighting came from tall poles that cast a weak, yellowish light on the cracked asphalt. The desert wind pushed fine sand against the sides of the trailer. There were only 2 trucks parked far apart. I chose the furthest spot possible. My cargo that night wasn't refrigerated, sensitive, or flashy. Sealed pallets, all paperwork in order, weight within the limit. Nothing that would warrant interest. I followed standard procedure, locked the doors, checked the mirrors, and turned off the engine. When the dashboard lights went out, an almost absolute silence filled the cabin. That's when I heard the first bang. It didn't sound like a punch. It didn't sound like someone hitting the outside of the trailer. It was muffled, metallic, irregular, as if it were coming from inside another trailer. I waited a few seconds thinking it was cargo being adjusted, but the sound returned, this time with 3 short thuds followed by something dragging. I looked in the right rearview mirror and saw the refrigerated truck parked 2 spaces behind. The detail that caught my attention was that the refrigerator was off. No constant noise from the auxiliary motor, no typical vibration of active refrigeration. Yet, something seemed to be moving inside. I stood there trying to convince myself it was my imagination. The silence returned, heavier than before, and I made the mistake of deciding to check. I got out of the cabin with the wrong feeling that I was doing something I didn't need to do. The early morning air was dry and cold, that fine desert chill that doesn't hurt but alerts you. The gravel under the soles of my boots seemed too high, as if each step was announcing my position. There was no movement in the other parking spaces. No doors opening, no engines starting, nothing. I walked toward the refrigerator, keeping enough distance so as not to seem too curious. The trailer was white, without a logo, with dust marks accumulated on the lower edges. The rear doors were closed, seals visible. Nothing visibly forced open. I touched the metal side. It was cold, but it didn't vibrate. I waited a few seconds in absolute silence, trying to catch any internal sounds. That's when I heard it again, this time more clearly. 3 muffled, spaced-out blows as if someone were conserving energy. It wasn't the load pattern settling. There was rhythm. There was intention. My first thought was simple. Someone got trapped. My second thought came too quickly. This isn't my responsibility. I looked around for the truck driver. The cab was dark, curtains drawn, no sign of occupancy, no license plate indicating a large company, no visible identification. It was at that moment that I saw lights appear at the entrance to the rest stop. A pickup truck pulled in far too slowly for someone who just wanted to park. It didn't go straight into the free spaces. It made a wide turn and positioned itself behind my truck. The engine remained running. The high beams were fixed on my rearview mirror. I didn't run back to the cab, and today I know that almost cost me dearly. I stood between my truck and the refrigerated truck, trying to appear indifferent to the presence of the pickup. Its engine remained running, steady, as if waiting for something to happen. The high beams suddenly went out, but the vehicle didn't move. That's when the feeling of being watched ceased to be just an impression. The truck door opened slowly, with a movement too controlled to be casual. A man got out holding something long against his leg, but not in a threatening way. He closed the door slowly and began walking toward the back of my trailer. There were no shouts, no running, no nervousness. There was method. I maintained a firm posture and began to back away toward my cabin, measuring each step. He didn't say anything, didn't quicken his pace, just adjusted his trajectory to keep the distance the same. When I reached the driver's door, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I climbed 2 steps at once and got into the cabin. I closed the door and immediately engaged the central locking, turning the key in the ignition almost reflexively. Before the engine had finished starting, I heard a sharp thud on the passenger window. The first blow didn't shatter it completely, but it created a web of cracks that spread in seconds. The second blow went right through. The glass shattered into the cabin with a violent sound, scattering fragments across the seat and dashboard. I felt small cuts on my arm as he tried to reach the inside door handle. The object he was holding was a heavy metal tool, not an improvised one. He knew exactly where to strike to create enough space. I didn't have time to think about courage or fear, only about the sequence of actions. Clutch pressed, key turned all the way, diesel engine responding with minimal delay. I kept my foot firmly on the accelerator as I released the parking brake and engaged first gear. The man tried to force his arm through the broken glass but couldn't reach the latch. The truck started moving the exact moment he lost his balance. The pickup truck behind me was blocking my front exit, so the only option was to go sideways. I turned the steering wheel sharply, ignoring the bad angle and the proximity of the loose gravel. The trailer responded with a heavy delay, dragging slightly before straightening out. I heard something hit the side of the cab, but I didn't stop to identify what it was. My only goal was to create distance. The pickup truck reacted quickly, accelerating to try and close my exit angle. It moved forward on the left side while I was still adjusting the alignment of the vehicle. The truck's total weight provided stability, but also limited any sudden maneuvers. If I misjudged the turn, I could end up sideways and completely vulnerable. I kept the accelerator steady, without any visible panic. I passed the rest stop exit almost scraping the low concrete curb. As soon as I reached the I-10 highway, I shifted into the next gear and increased the revs. The pickup truck tried to keep up for a few seconds, staying in the side lane. Its headlights were flashing intermittently, perhaps trying to disorient me. I maintained a straight line. After a few kilometers, she slowed down and disappeared in the rearview mirror. There was no long chase, no gunshots, no honking. Just the calculated retreat of someone who didn't get what they wanted. I kept driving without slowing down, feeling the cold wind enter through the broken glass and mix with the smell of dust and metal. I only slowed down when the mileage counter indicated a sufficient distance to make it impossible to catch me in a few minutes. The wind coming in through the broken glass started to really bother me, bringing in fine sand and the dry smell of the desert. My arm burned from the small cuts, but nothing deep enough to compromise my driving. What really weighed on me was the question I avoided answering. What would have happened if I had opened that refrigerator? I kept thinking about the muffled thumps I heard before the truck came into the rest stop. The pattern wasn't random. It wasn't the sound of loose cargo. It was a restrained, almost calculated rhythm, as if someone knew they couldn't draw too much attention. It didn't sound like a coincidence, and the synchronized arrival of the truck made it all seem even less natural. If someone was trapped inside, the plan was simple and cruel. Create enough curiosity to force a driver to approach and get out of the cab. With the truck unlocked and the driver out of control, all that was left was to surround them and take over. It wasn't about the refrigerated truck, it was about my truck. It was about cargo, paperwork, and a quick disappearance. I'd heard similar stories about crossing Texas and New Mexico, but I always dismissed them as gas station exaggerations. After that night on I-10, I stopped believing it was all just hearsay. Someone had planned the time, chosen the location, and counted on the desert's isolation. Nothing there seemed improvised. When I finally pulled into a well-lit gas station many kilometers later, I realized my hands were still tense on the steering wheel. The attendant asked about the broken window, and I simply replied that it was an attempted robbery. I didn't mention the refrigerator. I didn't mention the banging. I didn't mention the silence. Some things are better left unreported. I continued my journey after improvising a shield on the windshield, but the road seemed different from that night on. Each stop required calculation. Each distant light gained significance. The isolation that once represented peace became a variable of risk. Working across state lines has always involved exposure, but there it became clear how much we depend on split-second decisions. I-10 remained the same, but I didn't. I prefer not to give my name because I still pass through that area a few times a year. I don't know if that refrigerated truck actually had someone inside or if it was all part of a larger scheme. I didn't go back to check. I didn't file a detailed complaint. I didn't try to investigate. My priority was to keep the cargo and stay alive. Sometimes surviving means accepting that you won't have all the answers. What remained was the pattern, not the violence. The muffled sound, the synchronized arrival, the calculated roadblock, the direct attack on the cabin's most vulnerable point. Nothing there seemed impulsive. It was cold, practical, and functional. That's what bothers me most when I remember that early morning. If you're listening to this now, you understand what it's like to depend on constant attention on the road. You know that many situations start out too small to seem like a real threat. I almost turned curiosity into a fatal mistake. And it was a close call that night didn't end differently. If that story hit you even a little, take a second and hit like. Seriously. When you like and leave a comment, it tells YouTube to push these stories to more people who actually enjoy this kind of content. Drop a comment too, even just a quick thought about what you would have done in that situation. That kind of engagement really helps this channel grow, and if you're not subscribed yet, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let me tell you what happened on the next run. My name is Travis Cole. I'm 40 years old, and I've been driving long routes through the West for almost 2 decades. I've always believed that an empty road is synonymous with tranquility, especially in the deserted stretches of Nevada, where the horizon seems endless. That night I was cruising down a state highway off the main road, maintaining a steady speed and a clear head. The dashboard illuminated the cabin with a soft blue light, while the rest was just stark darkness. I had no idea that danger was already sitting beside me before I even realized it. I found him stopped on the shoulder next to an old sedan with its hood up. There were no streetlights, no town nearby, just sand, dry vegetation, and wind crossing the asphalt. The hazard lights reflected in the desert like a repetitive orange pulse. I slowed down, checking my rearview mirror to see if anyone was coming from behind, but the road was completely empty. I stopped because it seemed like the only human decision to make. He walked to the cabin with steps too firm for someone desperate. He showed no panic, only controlled urgency. He said the car had suddenly died and that he needed a ride to the next gas station 20 or 30 kilometers away. I hesitated for a few seconds before unlocking the passenger door. It was enough to change the course of that night. As soon as he got in, he carefully closed the door and adjusted the seat as if he'd done it before. I got back on the track and accelerated to nearly 100 kilometers per hour, maintaining a straight trajectory through the dark desert. The crosswind was constant, but nothing out of the ordinary. The silence inside the cabin lasted less than a minute. He looked ahead and commented that my daughter should be starting high school that year. I hadn't mentioned family. There was no photograph on the dashboard, no sticker on the window, nothing to reveal that detail. Even so, he said her full name, as if he were reading it from a report, and he still hadn't told me his own name. I kept my eyes fixed on the road for a few seconds, waiting for him to complete the sentence with some logical explanation. Maybe someone from my town had commented on something. Maybe he had mistaken me for someone else. The desert stretched darkly past the sides of the windshield, with no visual reference beyond the reflective strip. The digital speedometer remained steady near 100 kilometers per hour. My heart, however, did not. I asked him how he knew my daughter's name, trying to keep my tone neutral and casual. He replied that certain information is easy to find when you pay enough attention. He said it as if commenting on the weather forecast or road conditions. There was no explicit threat in his voice. There was no smile. The crosswind made the trailer sway slightly, and I corrected the direction with small adjustments to the steering wheel. That's when he commented that my house has a white fence on the right side, and that the dog usually stays tied up there when we're not home. I never mentioned any dog. I never mentioned the neighborhood. I never said the city. The dashboard partially illuminated his face, but not enough to read his expression clearly. He kept his hands resting on his legs, a posture too upright for someone recently rescued from the side of the road. He wasn't looking at me, only ahead, watching the asphalt disappear beneath the headlights. The silence between sentences was calculated. The road lay empty in both directions, a dark corridor surrounded by barren terrain and scattered low bushes. There was no town nearby, no gas station visible on the horizon, just miles of desert and no cell phone signal. And I began to realize I was driving too fast to be comfortable. I started slowing down almost imperceptibly, 2 or 3 kilometers per hour at a time without slamming on the brakes. The engine sound changed slightly in RPM, but nothing that immediately caught his attention. He noticed, because he commented that I always drive a little above the speed limit when I'm alone. I had never said what my usual speed was. The information didn't make sense. I asked him his name, trying to steer the conversation towards something normal. He only gave a common first name, too short to remember. He didn't offer a last name, didn't ask mine, showed no interest in formally introducing himself. It was as if he'd already moved past that stage. That bothered me more than the information about my family. That's when I noticed a detail while he was adjusting the position of his right leg. The hem of his pants rode up a few centimeters, revealing something attached to his boot. It wasn't large, but it was enough to recognize the shape. A narrow knife, discreetly tucked into the inner side of the leather. It wasn't loose there by accident. He kept his right hand resting precisely on the leg where the knife was hidden. He wasn't holding the blade, but the proximity was too clear to be a coincidence. The dashboard illuminated only the metallic outline for fractions of a second. My field of vision alternated between the road and that specific spot. We were still going over 90 kilometers per hour, in the middle of a completely empty stretch of desert. If I braked suddenly, I could lose control of the vehicle. If I accelerated, I would increase the risk. I needed a decision that didn't look like a decision, and I needed to make it before he decided to act first. I decided not to look directly at the knife again, because any change in my gaze could betray that I had noticed. I maintained a neutral posture, hands firmly on the steering wheel, controlled breathing and minimal movements. The desert continued to stretch ahead like an endless dark strip. The speedometer now read 88 kilometers per hour. The reduction was gradual enough not to seem strategic. He commented that the neighborhood where I live usually gets quiet after 10 o'clock at night. He said the street only has one main entrance and few visible cameras. He spoke as if describing a memorized map. There was no emotion in his voice, only observation. Each sentence seemed constructed to gauge my reaction. I casually asked where he lived, but he deflected the question by saying he travels a lot. He added that predictable people are easy to follow. He didn't use the word watch. He didn't use the word follow. Still, the meaning was too implicit to ignore. My focus on the road had to compete with mental calculation. I noticed on the dashboard that a small secondary detour would appear a few kilometers ahead, a dimly lit technical rest stop used for maintenance. It wasn't an official station, but it had open space and better lateral visibility. If I could get there without provoking a reaction, I would at least have room to maneuver. The decision needed to seem natural. He readjusted his leg's position, confirming that the knife was still there. His right hand was now closer to the handle. The silence inside the cabin grew heavy, unlike the comfortable silence of before. I knew that the next action would determine how that night would end. I signaled the detour as if it were routine, gradually reducing the speed to 60 kilometers per hour. I didn't brake abruptly, just let the truck lose power naturally. He asked if we were close to the service station, and I replied that I needed to check a noise in the axle before continuing. I maintained a technical, confident tone, as if it were standard procedure. The vehicle began to enter the open maintenance area. The space was wide, with a compacted gravel floor and lighting far enough away to create long shadows. As soon as I lined up the truck, I pulled the parking brake with controlled firmness. The engine continued running, vibrating under the cab as it always does. I needed everything to appear normal until the very last second. Every movement I made was calculated so as not to trigger an early warning. He moved his hand toward the knife almost imperceptibly when he realized he hadn't put one there. The gesture was quick, but not quick enough for me not to confirm his intention. Before he could fully draw the blade, I opened my door and got out of the cabin on the opposite side from him. I didn't run. I just moved decisively. As soon as my feet touched the ground, I quickly circled the front of the truck, keeping my distance from the passenger door. He opened the door almost at the same time, but the height difference and the weight of the cab worked in my favor. I stayed out of direct reach while he assessed the situation. The knife was now fully visible in his hand. Without saying a word, I returned to the driver's side of the cab, climbed the steps, and locked the door before he could get around the vehicle. I engaged the gear and released the brake in continuous sequence. The truck moved forward, leaving him on the gravel, stopped without chasing after it. In the rearview mirror, I only saw the silhouette diminishing in the dust. I only truly breathed a sigh of relief when I got back on the main highway and resumed a steady speed. The desert remained the same, dark and silent, but now it seemed larger than before. The speedometer read close to 90 kilometers per hour again. My hands were firmly on the steering wheel, but the tension was still there. The cabin had never felt so small. There was no chase, no headlights flashing behind me. He simply stood there motionless on the gravel, as if he had already decided that this attempt was over. That's what disturbed me the most. There was no desperation, no emotional outburst, just a completed calculation. For the rest of the trip, each kilometer marker seemed slower than usual. I mentally revisited every detail of the conversation, every phrase he uttered as if I were reading a file. I don't know how he knew about my family. I don't know how long he'd been observing me, or if it was all a contrived coincidence. What I know is that the knife wasn't for ordinary self-defense. It was positioned for quick access, hidden enough not to attract immediate attention. And the kind of information he had didn't come from an impromptu roadside conversation. It came from prior observation. Since that night in the Nevada desert, I no longer give rides on deserted highways no matter the situation. The road remains long, remains silent, but now I understand that not every request for help is just a request. Sometimes it's a test to see if you're willing to open the right door. The gate was open when it shouldn't have been. There was no illuminated sign, no active guard post, no record of nighttime operations in that yard. Even so, the recent tire tracks on the ground indicated constant movement. I knew it didn't make sense even before I turned off the motor, and yet I went in. My name is Caleb Turner, and I've been driving in the Southwest long enough to recognize when a place feels off. The company instruction was clear. Wait there until unloading clearance the following morning. The yard was isolated, surrounded by open desert and low metal sheds. There was no town nearby, just state highway and sand. After parking in the designated area, I turned off the engine and waited for silence to settle in. The desert wind swept across the terrain, kicking up fine dust against the sides of the trailers. The lighting came from tall poles with flickering white bulbs. With each flicker of light, the shadows shifted position. It was on the third swing that I noticed movement where there shouldn't be any. Two men were standing between trucks parked further back, unloading something quickly and in a coordinated manner. They weren't wearing uniforms, there was no forklift, and there was no official record of their activity. The rear doors of one of the trailers were open. I remained motionless inside the cab, watching through the side mirror adjusted to its maximum. The boxes they were moving had no visible identification and were being transferred from one truck to another. No interior lights were turned on to avoid attracting outside attention. This wasn't an overtime shift. This was something that shouldn't be happening. I remained seated in the cabin for a few minutes, pretending to review messages on the panel to justify leaving the interior light on. Every movement outside was quick and efficient, as if following its own schedule. There was no loud conversation, only short gestures and silent coordination. The surrounding desert remained completely dark beyond the reach of the streetlights. This was happening in the middle of nowhere. The transfer of goods was done directly between two trailers parked side by side. One of them wasn't on the list of vehicles scheduled for that yard that night. I had received the full schedule before leaving the base. I recognized at least 3 license plates that shouldn't have been there. This confirmed that I hadn't been imagining things. I decided not to interfere and just wait inside the truck until dawn. The plan was simple: remain invisible. If they didn't know I'd noticed, maybe it would all end there. I slightly adjusted the mirror to widen my view without leaning too far. The last thing I needed was to attract attention. That's when one of the men stopped for a second and looked directly in the direction of my truck. It wasn't a casual glance. It was an assessment. He remained motionless for several seconds, far too long to be a coincidence. Even with the uneven lighting, I felt I had been identified. Instinctively, I turned off the interior cabin light and remained completely still. My truck was positioned about 50 meters from their activity, but the line of sight was direct. I had a clear feeling that this distance was not enough. and at that moment I realized that the main gate was no longer open. I leaned slightly to see the gate in the side convex mirror. Where there had once been a free opening, there was now a chain running through the metal bars. I didn't hear the moment they closed it, which meant they did it while I was watching the back of the yard. The padlock reflected the intermittent white light of the lampposts. That wasn't an operational coincidence. I glanced back at the men in the background and noticed that one of them was no longer carrying boxes. He was walking towards me with controlled steps, without any apparent hurry. He wasn't running, shouting, or pointing at anything. He was simply steadily closing the distance. The other remained by the trailers observing. My first impulse was to start the engine immediately and drive toward the gate, but the interior space was too narrow for a sudden maneuver. There were trucks parked in parallel rows, creating tight corridors. If I got the angle wrong, I could get stuck between two trailers, and then there would be no second chance. I decided to keep the truck off for a few more seconds, trying to look like just another driver waiting to unload. The man kept approaching, now less than 30 meters away. The light flickered again, casting a long shadow of him on the concrete. He already knew I had seen him. That's when I heard the dry sound of a metal door slamming shut somewhere behind the sheds. It indicated more people in the yard, not just two men. The math changed instantly. I wasn't just trapped in an enclosed space. I was outnumbered on land they knew better than I did. I turned the key in the ignition with a firm, controlled movement, trying not to show urgency. The diesel engine responded with a deep rumble that echoed through the yard louder than I would have liked. At the same instant, the man walking towards me quickened his pace. It wasn't a frantic run. It was a calculated reaction. The white light flickered again, casting distorted shadows between the trailers. I engaged first gear and moved through the narrow corridor between two rows of parked trucks. The lateral space was limited, and any miscalculation could tear the side of my trailer. I maintained a low but constant speed, looking for a position for a larger maneuver. In the mirror, I saw at least two men moving parallel between the vehicles. One of them got into a pickup truck parked near the warehouses. The headlights flashed abruptly, cutting through the darkness of the yard with direct light. Now I had limited mobility against a light vehicle that could easily navigate around obstacles. The uneven concrete made the whole thing vibrate under the full weight of the load. I needed to use the truck's size to my advantage. The pickup truck started moving, trying to intercept my lane before I reached the center of the yard. I accelerated enough to gain momentum, but not so much as to lose control. I turned the steering wheel sharply, making the trailer follow with a heavy lag. The space between two trailers was minimal, but sufficient for a calculated passage. I heard the sound of something hitting the side of my trailer as I passed through a narrower area. I didn't stop to check the damage. The pickup truck appeared from the left, trying to block my path. The enclosed yard was now a maze of metal, concrete, and headlights crisscrossing the middle of the New Mexico desert. I knew I couldn't beat the pickup truck in agility, so I needed to force it into a miscalculation. I kept the truck straight for a few meters, and then turned abruptly to the right, entering an even narrower corridor between two parked trailers. The space was too tight for the pickup to continue at the same speed. The weight of my vehicle gave me stability, not speed. The pickup truck tried to maneuver around the outside of the lane, attempting to intercept me at the exit of the corridor. I increased the revs just enough to maintain constant momentum without losing traction. The uneven concrete made the steering wheel vibrate in my hands. Each side mirror was checked in fractions of a second. Any mistake there would leave me stranded. As I exited the corridor, I aligned the truck directly toward the main gate. The chain was still stretched between the metal bars, reflecting the white light from the lampposts. There was no time to get out and try to remove the padlock. The only viable option was to use the truck's own weight as a tool. I kept the accelerator steady. The pickup truck reappeared from the left, attempting to cut me off before I reached the gate. I ignored the approach and maintained my steady trajectory. The impact of the grille against the bumper was loud and sharp, followed by the snap of the chain stretched to its limit. The padlock couldn't withstand the combined force of weight and inertia. The metal structure gave way enough to create a partial opening. The truck slid through, dragging part of the side fence before hitting the outside asphalt. In my rearview mirror, I saw the pickup truck stop before the damaged gate. They didn't try to go beyond the yard's boundaries. I got the impression that this was already the maximum reach of their operation. I didn't slow down until the parking lot completely disappeared from the rearview mirror and the state highway resumed its normal silence. The New Mexico desert looked the same as always, but I knew it wasn't the same for me anymore. The engine revved steadily as I mentally reviewed every second of the chase. The cabin vibrated like any other night shift. Only now there was something different. I didn't immediately call the company or the local police. I only stopped when I had enough signal to file a basic report without mentioning every detail I had seen. I explained about suspicious activity and a gate being closed without authorization. I didn't describe the boxes or the faces. Some information needs to be delivered carefully. What became clear to me was that this wasn't an improvised operation. It was a structured operation with a controlled gate, positioned vehicles, and a silent transfer of goods. I had parked in the middle of something that was already underway, and I was noticed before I could leave without leaving a trace. Since that night, I haven't entered an isolated courtyard without confirming official activity through multiple sources. It doesn't matter what the schedule says. It doesn't matter how urgent the delivery is. The road teaches you quickly when you survive a wrong decision, and I barely survived. My name is Caleb Turner, and if there's one thing I've learned in the desert, it's that isolation doesn't mean safety. Sometimes it means the exact opposite. If you made it this far, hit like and let me know which story stuck with you the most. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. That kind of interaction helps YouTube push these stories to more people. If you're not subscribed yet, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next ones. Thanks for listening. Drive safe.